Marx's Das Kapital, a biography by Wheen. So just to be clear, this is not Das Kapital by Karl Marx itself. This is a book about Marx's Das Kapital. This is part of Atlantic Monthly's series, Books That Changed the World, in which several different authors write biographies of influential books. And yeah, I know the term biography doesn't really apply to books, but that's what they're calling it in this series. This book was very short, only 144 pages. I don't know what the other books in this series are like. This is the only one I've picked up, but I was able to read this whole thing in just a couple of days, which for me is moving fast. I'm generally a slow reader. So anyways, just a little bit maybe of personal background here. When I was in college, I changed political labels several times, as people do at that age. I was always some sort of maybe version of what I considered to be a democratic socialist, but at different times I called myself a socialist, a communist, an anarchist, a Marxist, etc. And if I would call myself a communist or a Marxist, I would have friends say, well, have you ever read Marx? Did you read the Communist Manifesto? Did you read Das Kapital? Which I had not, which, as you can imagine, was a little bit embarrassing for someone in my situation. I tried to make excuses, say, well, it's not really about the dogma, it's not really about copying Marx exactly, etc. But let's face it, those were just excuses for being lazy. I did eventually read the Communist Manifesto. I believe that was assigned reading for one of my history classes later on. I was required to write a couple of short reflection papers on that, and I've since turned that into one YouTube video, which is on this channel somewhere. The Communist Manifesto, if you've not read it, is pretty short and very easy to read. It's more of a pamphlet, really, than it is a whole book. It was written in 1848, so the language is a little bit stilted by today's standards, but it's easy enough to read, very painless. Das Kapital, however, has a reputation for being a very intellectual workout. Like, people who study economics for a living or people who major in economics have a very hard time making heads or tails of this book. Or so I'm given to understand. So even though I eventually did read the Communist Manifesto, I have stayed well away from Das Kapital. If anyone out there listening to this has read that book by chance, let me know what your experience of it was. I guess the only people I know who have tried to read it, when I was living in Australia, I was hanging out with a Trotskyist group. I wasn't officially a member of their group, but they let me hang out with them. And they would have weekly meetings where they would have like a study group of Das Kapital, and they were kind of very slowly working through it and explaining it to each other, which I think is what you would need to do if you were to read that book. It just has a reputation for being very dense and intellectual. So I don't think I could ever read it. Well, I don't know. Maybe I might give it a try someday. I say that about a lot of books. But I saw this book, and this book looked very light and readable, and I thought, okay, I'll read this book instead, if I can't read Das Kapital. Now, the author of this book, Wheen, I've actually read one of his books before. I read his biography of Marx. So when I picked up this book, I was wondering, because this book is quite short, right? Only 144 pages. And I thought, okay, am I going to get any new information out of this? Or is it going to be mostly all the stuff I've already read in his biography of Marx, just slightly repackaged? And the answer is actually, I don't remember. There seems to be some new stuff in here, but I actually can't remember his biography of Marx in enough detail to remember what information was new and what information was different. And to further complicate things, I've read two other biographies of Marx since Wheen's biography. So I'm not going to be able to do a side-by-side comparison with any accuracy. My memory is just two shot. If anyone else out there has read these books side by side, maybe they could do a better comparison. But, excuse me, I can say that the tone of the books is very similar. So in his biography of Marx, Francis Wheen takes this view that Marx has been made into like this evil genius by people who are conservatives. And he's been made into this like huge messiah by people who are communists. But in actuality, Marx was just a very flawed human being. He was neither evil genius nor revolutionary messiah. He was a terrible procrastinator. He had a terrible time writing this book. He procrastinated on it endlessly. He lied to his publisher about how far it was along. He lied to his friends, told them it was almost finished when it wasn't. And he generally just showed a remarkable inability to just buckle down and get the thing done. And that comes in Marx's Wheen's biography of this book. Now, as a result, we do not have the completed Das Kapital. There were a planned 6 volumes of this book. Marx only finished 1 volume during his lifetime. For the other volumes, I think we just have his leftover notes. A point Wheen emphasizes repeatedly is, despite the fact of Marx's disciples trying to make dogma out of his work, there actually is no completed Bible of Marx's theory, because Marx just never finished it before he died, which I thought was very interesting. Another point that Wheen makes is that Das Kapital is not intended purely to be a work of economics. Rather, there's a great deal of art that goes into it here as well. Marx is using humor, he's using irony, he's using literary and poetical illusions. This is a book that's always intimidated me, as I said before, but I've got to say that after reading Francis Wheen's description of it, it actually doesn't sound half bad to me. It sounds like this book could be quite interesting. I don't know, maybe I will give it a try one of these days. And then lastly, as you would expect from a book like this, Wheen does spend a significant amount of time analyzing the actual ideas in Das Kapital. And this is where the book is really worthwhile for somebody like me who's never read Das Kapital and probably never will. Wheen's very sympathetic to Marx. He believes that Marx has failed as a prophet of what was going to happen. But he believes that Marx was very extraordinary as an analyst of what was currently happening. Or in other words, the communist revolutions did not happen the way Marx predicted they would. But Wheen thought that Marx gave a very excellent analysis of what capitalism was, how it functions, and what its inherent instabilities were. Wheen goes on to assert that even though Marx's theories have been unfairly maligned in the West, much of Marx's analysis has been subsequently vouched for by later mainstream economists. In fact, Wheen argues that Keynesian economics, with its belief that capitalism unregulated and left to its own devices is inherently unstable, is very similar to Marx's own analysis. So it's a fascinating book. I don't know if I will ever try and read Das Kapital, but this book at least made me curious about it. And if I never go on to read Das Kapital, then this book gave me a lot of insight that I would never otherwise have had.